Hi, my message today is entitled Lockdown in the Upper Room. I don't know whether you've taken a really long journey. Well, when I used to work for ADRA, some of the journeys that I would take 2 or 3 days just to get where we were going to. And one journey I remember in particular was to Eastern Congo. Now, it was hard to get to Eastern Congo, especially as we were living in those days in Burkina Faso. So that's from West Africa to East Africa, and the connections aren't good, and Africa is absolutely massive. So it took several days finally before I came from Rwanda by taxi, arriving on the frontier with Goma. And from Goma, we then took a UN flight inland to a place called Beni. And from Beni, I took a pickup truck for another couple of hours to a place called Butembo. And Butembo was the furthest place practically that I'd get to in that journey. I was as far away from home as it was possible to be, or so it felt. Now, um, the reason we were going was to visit a village which had been destroyed in recent fighting, and to which apparently refugees were beginning to come back, and to see whether ADRA could be involved in a house reconstruction project there for the refugees. And we got there late in the evening. I remember the vegetation was luxuriant in the evening sun. I thought England was green, but with the banana trees and this incredible vegetation, it was incredibly green, and it contrasted against the red soil tracks that we had been driving along. And that evening in the hotel, we met a local businessman. We wanted to get some advice on how secure it was to take this road up to the site of where we wanted our project to take place. And he replied in French, he said, C'est compliqué. It's a little tricky. What do you mean? We asked. And he said, well, I'm going to have to speak with the commander of the government forces. And then I'm going to need to talk to also someone in the rebel side. And then there are the Mai Mai. Well, you understand, we weren't exactly thrilled at the prospect. And then to top it all, it was raining very heavily that day, and the advice was do not travel on this road. You cannot travel on it when it's rainy. So we had to leave it a day before we went up the track. Now, in my whole life, I've never been on a road like this one. Now, there was virgin forest on either side. One place it was so impassable that there'd been a truck which had veered off into a ditch that people were trying to dig out. And the track had become a swamp in certain places, such that the driver had to maintain a fast speed just to make it through 100-yard stretch of mud. Yet the layer of mud was underpinned by this kind of hard track. And we were traveling so fast along this, it was like traveling in air turbulence. My head kept hitting the ceiling several times as we were bouncing along the track. And in the back of the 4x4, standing on the back and holding onto the sides with a pair of ski goggles on his face to protect his eyes, the Congolese businessman was holding onto the structure of the vehicle. To all intents and purposes, he looked like a crazy Roman charioteer. I felt very exposed, as far from home as I think I've ever been. And as we rounded the corner of the road and slithered to a halt after this 100 yards of swampy mire, an army motorbike with a passenger riding pillion rounded the corner the other way. Now I thought, what's going to happen now? Well, the local businessman jumped out of the 4x4. And a strange thing happened. The military officer, he descended from the motorbike, and then they hugged one another. C'est un frère, the businessman said. He's a brother. He was baptized last week. Congo is a place of great ambiguity. Nothing is quite what it seems. Yet in this place of sometimes great darkness, still God's presence can be felt. However far you are away from home, you are not alone. David wrote in Psalm 139, verse 7 to 12, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." I'd like to tell you today, however far you go from home, God got there first. My friends, I cannot but reflect with you about the momentous events that we've been living through with the lockdown and with the coronavirus. Who would have believed that the entire planet could be brought to a standstill? That not only could you not travel across national boundaries, but you couldn't even leave your house. That schools would be very largely shut, that churches would be closed, and that so many people would be added to the government's payroll or would lose their jobs. And this not just in one country, but in all of them. Even 3 short months ago would have been unthinkable. But how are we to view this from a theological perspective? I mean, if God's Spirit is working overtime and everywhere, what does He want us to learn from this experience? Now, let me be clear. I don't think that God is the author of this misfortune. Just think of some biblical passages. We know from Revelation 12:12, for instance, that God has an enemy, the devil, who has come down to earth in great wrath because he knows that his time is short. Elsewhere, Peter describes the devil as prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So I see COVID-19 as much more of a diabolic invention than an act of God, whether leaked in a Wuhan laboratory or brewed in a live animal market. When Boris Johnson called it a devilish disease, he may have spoken truer than he imagined. Note this quotation from Ellen White, which chimes with the story of the book of Job. She wrote this: "In accidents and calamities by land and by sea, in great conflagrations, in fierce tornadoes and terrific hailstorms, in tempests, floods, cyclones, tidal waves and earthquakes, in every place and in 1,000 forms, Satan is exercising his power. He sweeps away the ripening harvest, and famine and distress follow. He imparts to the air a deadly taint, and thousands perish by the pestilence. The visitations that have become more and more frequent and disastrous." Wow. Well, COVID-19 and the reaction to it are on a totally unprecedented scale, and so much so that we must ask ourselves, what is going on? And what lessons should we be drawing from this crisis? To what can we compare our situation? Well, are we facing the time of trouble? You may recall the story of Jacob, who stole the birthright from his twin brother Esau. How his brother wanted to kill him after he did that, had to flee. And 20 years later, he's returning home after he's been cheated in turn by his father-in-law Laban. And he comes to the crisis of his life as he learns that Esau is coming to meet him and 400 men with him. Now, not only is he terrified, but he's also guilt-ridden. And so that night he wrestles all night with God, wanting to make sure of God's favor and pardon. And you remember how he holds on to him and said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." That night, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. We may not be facing the time of trouble spoken of by the prophet Daniel, but some wrestling with God may be in order. Wrestling with God. How few know what it is, wrote Ellen White. How few have ever had their souls drawn out after God with intensity of desire until every power is on the stretch. Or maybe we're facing a Pella moment. Let me explain. You remember Jesus' warning to the disciples recorded in Luke chapter 21, verse 20. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So said Jesus. Years later, AD 68, the Roman legions are encircling Jerusalem. The banners of the infidel pagan armies of Rome come within spitting distance of the city walls and are standing on holy ground. And the Christians in Jerusalem, remembering Jesus' words, wake up. Then the siege lifts unexpectedly. And heeding Jesus' words, they flee from the city and cross over the Jordan River to reach the relative safety of Pella, one of the 10 towns of the Decapolis. The siege resumes after they've left, and in August AD 70, after fearful anguish and terrible suffering, the city and temple are destroyed with many of the people in it. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote about the siege which he lived through, and he said that 1.1 million people died in these events. But no Christian, we're told, actually was killed because they heeded Christ's warnings and left the city. So are we facing a Pella moment? Maybe not. But as history accelerates, maybe we need to start getting serious about the one in whom we can take refuge. Or perhaps it's different again. Maybe you saw, I've seen this cartoon, which was shared on the church WhatsApp recently. It reads as follows. After 3 days of isolation inside a fish, Jonah came out with a mission and changed a city. After 40 days isolation on a mountain, Moses came out with 10 commandments and changed a nation. And after 40 days isolation in the wilderness, Jesus came out in power and changed everything. The question in the cartoon puts is this: what are you coming out of isolation with? What needs to change? Maybe the most fertile parallel with our current situation is the upper room experience. You remember that after Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, he remained with his disciples 40 days until his ascension. Then Jesus instructed them to remain in Jerusalem under lockdown for another 10 days until they received power from on high. 10 days in lockdown in the upper room. Afterwards, Pentecost. The Holy Spirit fell on the disciples. They were changed, and they changed the world. Peter, the man who just recently had cowered before the taunting question of a servant girl and denied his master, became the mighty man of God, who charged upon priest and rabble the murder of the Son of God, until the crowd became a reverent congregation and thousands cried out to God for mercy. James and John, who'd wanted to elbow their way into the best positions in Jesus' kingdom and call down fire on a Samaritan village for having turned Jesus away, were transformed. After Pentecost, James became the mighty man of prayer, and John, the spiritual and lowly one, who caught the sweetest whispers of divine love. You see, you may not have noticed, but before Jesus sent his disciples out with the Great Commission, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations," he said, "Stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." For those who are in lockdown, maybe this is what this is all about. Stay so you can go. Says Leroy Froome in his book, The Coming of the Comforter. Our temptation is to perpetual activity, to the exclusion of time needed for prayer, study, and spiritual meditation. We work on frenziedly, much like the toiling disciples who labored all night and caught nothing. But in the early grey of the dawn, a few minutes in the direct presence and under the specific direction of the Master filled their empty nets. And he goes on. There was a historic Pentecost when the Spirit was poured out on the church, but there is also a personal Pentecost when he fills the individual believer. And this personal Pentecost is the birthright of every child of God. Jesus is infinitely nearer now than when he washed his disciples' feet. The greatest reality that the world doesn't see is the reality of the Holy Spirit. So may the legacy for you this lockdown period be your own personal Pentecost.